I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from sociologist Charles Derber about his new book, Fighting Oligarchy: How Positive Populism Can Reclaim America. We'll be talking about the forces of oligarchy in American society today and how there are two visions of populism, one of which, Charles argues, can pose a real challenge to those oligarchic forces. But before we get to that conversation, I need to remind you that this show is, with the exception of my one sponsor, the mighty Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window, pretty much entirely listener funded. So please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, check out my sponsor, Mike Swanson's great financial and trading newsletter, wallstreetwindow.com. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips, so I think that's all that needs to be said. It's a really worthwhile newsletter if you're into financial and trading news. Mike's a straight shooter. Check it out at wallstreetwindow.com. And now on to the conversation with Charles Derber. Welcome back to Parallax Views. I guess that I'm very happy to have back on the program. Charles Derber is professor of sociology at Boston College. He is the author of 30 books, most recently Dying for Capitalism, Who Owns Democracy, Bonfire, and the book we're going to be talking about on this edition of the program, Fighting Oligarchy: How Positive Populism Can Reclaim America. How are you doing, Charles?
Good to see you. Glad we're talking about this. It's given what's going on today. I hope we'll get into the war because that's part of the populist issue as well. But it's a grim time. Yeah.
Well, I guess to start out, I think that the term populism in certain sectors has gotten a bad rap over the past decade or so, and even before that. There's not necessarily many people that will differentiate between right-wing populism and left-wing populism, and some people just say, well, all populism is the same. It's the rabble and it's demagogues taking advantage of the rabble, and it all ends in authoritarianism or totalitarianism, and I think you would take issue with that. So I want to get into that and maybe defining what we mean by populism.
Yeah. Well, it's good you brought that up. So I think you're right. Most Americans, they hear the word populism, they think of the rabble, the idea that it's just people, a mob, who are violent or have extreme views and want to overturn everything. And I think you're right. That is one of the commonplace views. But it's interesting for people who are maybe a little bit more politically engaged, they know that Trump ran in a tradition which is known as far-right populism. A lot of people would think of it as a kind of phony populism. The word populism really suggests a movement that says there's something wrong with elites running a country, that there are small groups of people in the country who are basically not ruling in the interests of ordinary people. And historically, two different kinds of populism have emerged. Although I think you're absolutely right. Many people think of all forms of populism as dangerous and bad. But I think that the historical record suggests that these two kinds of populism are both powerful in America, and they're very different. So Trump's far-right populism has a long tradition in America. It goes back to America First, which Trump named his movement after, which was a pro-Nazi movement in the 30s. It goes back further than that with the Jim Crow regimes. But basically, far-right populism says the country is being run by enemies of the people. It typically says they're elites. They're often Jewish elites or foreign banks or other they might be tied in with, immigrants or Black and brown people. This tradition of right-wing populism is very tied to far-right white Christian nationalism, which has a long history in America. So when Trump ran saying, look, I'm going to shake things up, because all populists do try to shake things up. They say something is fundamentally wrong with the country. It's being run by the wrong people, and it's being run against the interests of the great majority of ordinary people. And that's kind of the generic populist message. And Trump was very persuasive that he was going to blow things up in a good way. I mean, working class people thought, well, the Democrats have had their chance with Biden. We're feeling we can't afford things. There's still a lot of war going on that we don't like. It's diverting money from, what we need at home. And so Trump was able to persuade people that he was going to basically take on the tiny, rich, powerful elites and make the country finally work for ordinary people. Now, there's a long history of that. The history always shows that what Trump did is pretty much characteristic. The populist far right sort of brand of populism becomes authoritarian. It says we have so much danger from these foreign, whether bankers or, some foreign terrorists, whoever. We have to take enormous control to get rid, because these people are an existential threat to America. So Trump's authoritarian kind of government is not surprising, because almost all far right populism, far right populism
Real
after.
quick, it's not just not to interrupt you, but it's not just like, oh, the evil foreign terrorists or the evil foreign bankers. It's also
Right.
like there's tends to be within this sort of right-wing populism there's an enemy within that has subverted the republic.
Absolutely. Yes. And the book offers a history just to show, I'm not making this up, that there are these long periods of far right populism. And you're absolutely right that far right populism targets foreign influence, but also targets domestic enemies. I mean, people who are not true Americans. They're usually people of color. They're often bankers or sometimes real corporations. I mean, what's curious and sort of surprising is that if you look in the 30s, for example, you had people like Father Coughlin, who was part of the America First movement. The America First movement was during the Depression. Usually populism occurs when things are really hard for ordinary people, they're not getting by. And so they hear a populist message that says, we know you're suffering. And there's a reason you're suffering. And it's these small groups of people and these enemies inside the country who are linked to enemies abroad, who we're going to take care of for you. But you're going to have to give us power to do that. So you're absolutely right. Right-wing populism targets an enemy within. And what's interesting is that they claim to speak for ordinary workers. For example, people like Father Coughlin or the America First movement, Charles Lindbergh, they were, or say Huey Long, the famous governor of Louisiana that people often compare to Trump in the 30s. I mean, he was genuinely talking about the problems of workers in the Depression, and he had a pretty good program. Huey Long did a social welfare program as part of that right-wing populism. But Trump's brand, I call it Trump's trick in the bush. He ran on the idea that he was going to get rid of the powers in America that were making life hard for ordinary working people. And instead, he aligned and, filled his cabinet and his government with billionaires, the richest people in America. You remember when he was inaugurated, he was surrounded by the 7 richest Americans in the country, who were the Silicon Valley elites. And these people are in the cabinet and are running things. So Trump's populism ended up as a complete betrayal of the ordinary people who voted for him, because they voted thinking that he was going to make good on his promise to make life affordable and to bring back the country for, white Christian, real Americans, and particularly to solve their economic problems. Instead, he did what right-wing populists almost always do. He aligned with corporate wealthy elites and basically used tax policy and deregulation and military policy to help the people who were already screwing the American worker very badly. He just made it much worse. So inequality has risen. And it's done exactly what right-wing populism traditionally does, even though right-wing populism claim they're ruling in the name and for ordinary working people. Now, you're beginning to see, we can talk about this later, that the people who voted for Trump are souring on him because they can't afford their groceries, they can't afford their gas prices, and they realize that something was wrong. Trump did shake things up, but not in the way he promised. They wanted things to be shaken up. Now, what about the Democrats? And sort of what I'm reading about as the possible solution to this problem. There's also a long tradition in America of progressive populism or left-leaning populism. There are a lot of words for it, but it developed with, in a really telling example, which I'm sure you know about, maybe of your listeners may. In the first Gilded Age, back in the 1890s, you got the robber barons of, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, the people who sort of founded American modern capitalism. And they were running the country with all their money. The country was very, very unequal as it is today. The rich had almost everything. The poor had, and the working people had very little. And there emerged in the 1890s an agrarian, because the country was mainly agricultural at this point, a movement of populists. It was called the Populist Party populist movement. And I write a lot about them. They were very progressive. They were getting screwed by Wall Street at the time. They were, they depended on credit for their farming like farmers do today, and interest rates were very high. So they wanted ordinary people to actually take over Wall Street. So they had a sort of Bernie Sanders kind of view of the world, that these wealthy elites were screwing them, and they were right. But what happened, and this is a morality lesson for today, in 1892, the first Gilded Age populists, they merged with the Democratic Party. And in 1890, they created the People's Party in 1892, and they didn't win, but they got a respectable turnout. And then they joined with the Democratic Party in 1896, and they got sold down the river. They didn't have the kind of radical, ordinary people at that time were really hurting. I mean, the rich, they were building palaces. They thought they were British nobility. And some of your listeners may know that Rockefeller and Morgan built these famous palaces in Newport, Rhode Island that looked like British nobility houses, and they were the aristocracy. That was the first Gilded Age. We're in the second Gilded Age today, where we have a new set of robber barons. Most of them live out in California, in Silicon Valley, and their names are people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Jeff Zuckerberg and so forth. And these guys are the new robber barons. And what a progressive populism does, it says, look, we know that these new cadre of very wealthy people are going to do everything they can to track you, to sort of in the name of freedom and all corporate regulation. And they're going to hook you on all my students tell me they're on 4 or 5 hours a day on Instagram and TikTok because they're hooked by the seduction of all the feeds and all on Instagram and TikTok that they get, many hours a day. So we have a new wired technology, operating from the Silicon Valley. They're the Magnificent Seven, in case your viewers don't know, the 7 wealthiest corporations in America. They're all high-tech corporations. They're worth, NVIDIA, the chip company, is worth several $1 trillion, over $5 trillion. So we have even more than it's worth thinking about the relation between the first Gilded Age and the second age. The first Gilded Age bred a real progressive populist movement, and it did lead to some progressive changes over the next 20 or 30 years. The Democratic Party ruined it. That's a very good morality lesson for thinking about a problem that a lot of people think, which is, can we trust the Democratic Party today to be part of a progressive populist movement that just doesn't peck around and sort of take the money of the corporate consultants and the corporate donors, but actually runs working people candidates and actually does try to make changes in the way this country runs that will actually solve the problems that ordinary working people have. And the good news here is that there's a history of substantial change that, far-right populism has been very popular in America in certain groups and has done a lot of damage, a lot of harm, and is the foundation of understanding Trump. You can't understand Trump if you don't know the history of far-right populism. I talk a lot about that history in the book. But you can have hope or understand what should be done today if you don't know the history and the story of left-leaning populism, which also has a good history. Beyond the Gilded Age populists, the New Deal during the Depression brought tens of thousands of workers occupying their factories saying, we're going to take over our workplace unless you give us decent wages and a good job. And you had, in the 60s, where I cut my political teeth, you had a civil rights movement and an anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. And you had, I mean, a really good example of what I think of as a good model of the kind of progressive populism that this book tells people you should really be voting for and working for is Martin Luther King, because King, people think of him as a civil rights activist. But you remember where King was killed? He was killed in Memphis,
Memphis.
Tennessee.
Memphis, yeah.
And why? Because he had gone to join a strike by garbage workers in Memphis. And he knew it was very dangerous, but he had concluded and talked about the fact you couldn't get civil rights passed that would really help ordinary Black people in this country unless you had a large coalition with working people across race. And so he took a, he gave up his life for the idea that you couldn't develop civil rights without a kind of melding of anti-racist kind of politics. He said, we can't just have Black people fighting. You've got to meld Black people with all the working people in the country who are suffering and need to defeat these very popular, these very powerful elites. We need this large coalition. He said the same thing. He said that you had to also oppose war. He said, how can I oppose? I'm talking still about Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King said, how do you expect me to oppose violence against Black people in the South when America is killing Asian people in Vietnam? Over and over and over again for years. And so he not only went to Memphis to join the labor movement, he said, we have to become part of the anti-war movement. And he joined all the young people who were out in the streets protesting like we are with the No Kings Day today. And it's coming up, it's going to be about the Iran war. King was a big part of the anti-war movement as well. So I'm saying this just to say that this history gives us a lot of lessons about what we can do today. Well, first of all, what we're dealing with today, because we've dealt with many of this stuff before. Right-wing populist forces have run the country for a long time. And second, to say there really is a tradition and a sort of way of resisting, which we're beginning to see, which offers some hope. So there's bad news in just how deeply rooted this far-right populism is in America, but there's good news in that there's a very powerful tradition of progressive populism, which also says we're going to unite of all the working people in America, all the ordinary people, against these small elites that are ripping us off blind. And so the book is really about those two stories of populism, those two types of populism, an argument about why we shouldn't be surprised about the kind of neo-fascist form that Trump represents. That's always been part of far-right populism. And we should not be mystified about the millions of people on the streets who are they'll be there about the Iran war on March 28th coming up. And they're going to be there around basic oil prices and economic prices that they haven't been able to pay, on their kitchen table. So I think the book really gives a very readable, context. I try to write, I'm a professor, but I try to write for ordinary people. So this book is written for ordinary people who are finding that they don't like what's going on in this country, either economically, militarily, environmentally, and to show there really is a long story about this, and we can learn from it in terms of what we do about it.
I know you want to talk more about positive populism, but I do want to talk about the sort of right-wing
Yes,
variant of
good.
populism a bit more because you mentioned sort of Trump playing this trick. I don't think it's actually starting with Trump, though. And I know in the
No,
book you cover pretty in depth the John Birch Society. And I've always found the Birch Society interesting because upon first glance, they sort of have this framing of, you're getting screwed by Wall Street and Main Street is not being served. But I mean, it was founded by a rich candy manufacturer,
right,
Robert Welch.
right.
And it seems like in a lot of ways, a lot of these right-wing populist movements are funded by a segment of elites or at least very wealthy people that are trying to protect their interests. But they're saying, oh, well, you need patriotic rich people like me or patriotic elites like me, Robert Welch. And I don't know that it's all to the benefit of, the common man.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's really important. I just mentioned that in the 30s, where you had this America First, that, Henry Ford was a big part of that. The scion of Oaks, Quaker Oats was head of the America First. The DuPont family was big in. So you're right. Even back then, there were conservative corporate elites who were very much part of far right populism, and they were claiming to represent ordinary people. Then you skip from the 1930s to where you went, which is the late 50s, early 60s, the John Birch Society. That started the Republican movement toward Goldwater and then toward Nixon and Reagan. And that's where that sort of corporate, this is this really weird stuff. And you're absolutely right. There's nothing new about Trump. The trick he played is a trick the Republican Party has been trying to play for a long time. They say, we're going to represent the ordinary people, but they get funded by, and they're organized just like the John Birch Society, Candyman, now today it's the Mars Company. They claim that they're speaking up for ordinary working people. But what they do is they run both a tax policy and a corporate regulation policy, which is deregulate everything. And they attack, what these far right populists do is they create organized movements to divert people's anger from themselves, from wealthy elites, toward, prime prize, easily scapegoated targets. So,
Real quick,
yes,
I think though they do attack wealthy elites at times, but they have this
they
weird
do.
game they play where they'll say, well, the Wall Street people, these elites, they're not real capitalists. I think the Birch Society says it's socialism for the rich. They're basically saying that, oh, the Wall Street people, they're actually Marxists. It's a
Right.
very bizarre thing that they
It
do.
is. And I write about that a little bit in the book. That's very confusing because sometimes these far right populists, including Trump, they go after America. That Trump, who did he go after? He said, well, these globalizing companies are taking your job. American companies are outsourcing their jobs. And they don't like you. They don't want you. And, I'm going to stop that. I'm going to prevent that from happening. So you're right. You're absolutely right that while they always govern in the interests of themselves and elites, they put out messages that are very confusing because they seem to attack. It's so interesting that, like you say, the John Birch Society would say, "Oh, these Wall Street people are Marxists," and which is the craziest thing, because when you think about Wall Street, the heart of capitalism and Marxism, they don't go together very easily. But that is the kind of language that you do see, and there are some far right populists who do, like Huey Long. The John Birch Society never offered much of a real program for working people. But, under Reagan, some of his far right populists, they did offer some pretty, progressive working policies around stopping globalization, stopping outsourcing, and that sort of thing. So it is a confusing message to decode because you're right that far right populists are usually wealthy people, and they use very seductive language sometimes. One, it's seductive because it's like, let's go back to Trump on this. It seems very much like I am going to change this country in a way that you've never seen before. And Trump was very credible about that. In fact, he's done it in some ways. And the working people who voted for him felt that, yeah, I am ready for somebody who's going to shake this friggin' system up. And Trump is a guy who's going to really rock everything about the structure, and he's going to make it work for me, particularly if I'm a white, hardworking American who's not getting by, can't pay my rent or can't afford a house or whatever. But so Trump was playing into a long tradition. You're right that very often corporate elites themselves are blamed, or even though they're people who are actually funding the far right populists. It's a very complicated tradition, which I try to explain in the book, but because it's important, because Trump is a reflection of that tradition. People say Trump is completely new. He's not at all. He represents this very old tradition. So if you want to understand Trump fully, and you better, because even if Trump goes out, you've got Vance and Stephen Miller and his cabinet who will perpetuate this kind of far right populism without Trump. So it's important to understand.
I just wanted to add to that real quick. I do think people have a short memory because even someone like, Trump is not completely new. I've said to people,
Right. That's what I was
Ross
saying.
Perot in 1992 tapped into
Right.
populist sentiments. Now, I don't
Right.
think he wasn't vile in the way that Trump is, but he was
Yeah.
tapping into the same populist anger.
Right.
We've seen waves of this before.
Absolutely. This far right, I mean, there have been waves of both left-leaning populism, right. To stay with far right for a minute. So when were the waves? I mean, in most recent times, in the 30s, you get waves very often, like I say, when the economy is in trouble. Because populism is a tradition that says things are really, really bad for ordinary people. So when there's a depression or a recession or severe inequality where working people are having a really hard time, you're going to have some kind of populist government or political movement because a mainstream, I'm just going to play around in the existing system, ain't going to cut it because ordinary people who vote are going to say, I'm done with that. It's not, I can't put food on the table or I can't put enough. I can't send my kid for health care or, for good vocational education, whatever it is. So you're going to need populism to win. And you're right. So in a way, it's not whether, for who's going to be running this country, it's going to be some kind of populist. The question is, are the right-wing populists going to persuade people they're the ones who are going to make things work for ordinary people, or is it the progressive populists? The problem with the Democrats is they try to play like these all populists, or what you said at the very beginning of our conversation. They are somebody like Kamala Harris is saying, look, I like capitalism. I'm not a rabble rouser. I'm a good person. I'll help everybody. But she was not claiming to overthrow the powers that be. She said, I'm a proud capitalist. There was nothing big change about her, whereas Trump was running on the idea this system is really fucked up. We've got to change it in some very basic way. Same thing with Hillary Clinton 4 years earlier. She was saying, look, I know how to run the show. My husband ran the country well. Bill Clinton was the architect of a Democratic Party that has pushed positive populism off the agenda for the
Right, the
Democratic
third
Party.
way in the Democratic
Yeah, and
Leadership
he
Council.
called it, yeah, this sort of the third way. He called it the third way, which was saying we're no longer like the New Deal, where we're really trying to align with ordinary working people. He said, we're done with that. We're going to be basically just sort of orienting to help ordinary, we're just going to make a few reforms, but we're going to play within the system. That was catastrophic. I mean, Clinton did win 2 terms. Obama had a lot of Clinton's thing. They moved away from the New Deal kind of positive populist politics, which is all about class, understanding how our economy works and that capitalist, very wealthy people are running our government. The Democratic Party used to talk about that in the New Deal, and they won over, in the 1930s through the 1940s and 50s and up to Johnson, they won over the great majority of American workers who were Democrats. Ever since the Democrats, starting in the 70s, moved away from that kind of positive populist politics. Workers, this is the biggest earthquake in American politics for the last 50 or 60 years. The people who were all Democrats, the American working people, they all migrated. This is the biggest migration or immigration, if you want to call it. Ordinary workers migrated over the last 50 years from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And it happened under Nixon, who used the silent majority to argue these left-wing, anti-war people and civil rights people are going against, white people. And it then occurred with Reagan, who pulled a large number of white working class people up through, and then Obama just scared more of them off. And and then you had Kamala Harris and Clinton, who seemed to reflect that rejection of any kind of real change. In other words, there was no whiff of populism. They were mainstream people. And that was disastrous for the Democrats. It led to the abandonment of the Democratic Party. And now, the majority, remember, 60% of Americans do not have college education. They're not the upper middle class. They're not the professional educated people. So it really matters how ordinary working class people are thinking. They're the majority of the electorate. They are the dominant voter. And they are seeing the Democrats basically say, we're not going to, well, I would say now in the last 6 months or so, there's been some change. So there is a kind of new positive populist energy beginning to emerge among some Democrats, not just Bernie Sanders and AOC, but people like, say, Chris Murphy's Democratic senator from Connecticut, Chris Von Hollen, the Democratic senator from Maryland, Jeff Merkley, the Democratic senator from Oregon, because Trump has screwed things up so badly that it's almost impossible not to take. Remember, populism, you started this very correctly to say we should be talking about populism. You're absolutely right. And so I'm coming back to populism. The Democrats have got to be populist if they expect to get any votes this coming fall, because what people are going to be voting on is the prices at the pump, the amount of economic pain that this new war and all the problems that were obviously leading to, up to Trump's election, where he said Americans are being, ordinary working Americans can't live, and minorities and women are being prioritized. The Democrats are blaming you, the white worker. And so he seemed to be speaking for the white worker. That is a catastrophe for the country if a lot of white workers believe that, because white workers do not deserve to be called racist and deplorable, as Hillary Clinton. They need to do what Roosevelt did during the New Deal and what Johnson did, say, look, the Democratic progressives have to say, we understand that ordinary working people, which is the majority of the country, are having great problems. It's real. And we may not be in a depression right now, although who knows what the war may bring. But when Trump won re-election, he won. Everybody understands it. He won because ordinary workers voted for Republican. They've been migrating that way because ever since the end of the New Deal, the Democrats have been running away from populism. We were running away from New Deal. Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton play a big role in that. Kamala Harris plays a big role in that. Even Obama, under Obama, the gulf between wealthy Black people and poor Black people grew very substantially. So this is something that Martin Luther King understood. I mean, being Black or running on just civil rights or anti-racist politics is not proven to be the best way to deal with problems of racism, which are obviously very real, the economic problems faced by Black people, which are very big. But the only way to deal with them, as King understood, he got killed defending white garbage workers in Memphis. He understood that the future of the civil rights movement was with a kind of New Deal, class-based politics, not a kind of what I call, in the book I talk about the Democrats having embraced a kind of siloed identity politics. Every identity group, gay, trans, white, Black, feminist, is considered a siloed group that you appeal to. That's death for positive populism. Because what positive
real quick, can I add to that real
sure.
quick? Because I think one of the most interesting points you make in that regard is, and I don't think you're saying all identity politics is bad. You're not saying opposing racism is bad or supporting gay rights is bad. You're saying that's good. But what's interesting is what this form of identity politics that the Democratic Party has pushed has done is it's as you put it on, I believe, page 79. It's divided the working class into these multiple racial, ethnic, and religious silos that are competing against each other for corporate crumbs from the corporate elite class. Which can you talk a little bit more about that? What do you mean when you say they're competing for crumbs?
Well, in other words, if you're not having what the New Deal does, it brought together white workers, Black workers, gays, straights, and so forth. The capitalists love this new form of identity politics because it says you're going to vote basically on your own specific narrow group identity. You're not trying to form what Martin Luther King was trying to do, which was form a larger coalition. And when you're, a Black person competing with a brown person, competing with an Asian American, competing with a poor white, this is just a dream world for corporations, right? Because what the people, the elites who run the country really fear is that the mass of ordinary people, all of whom they're screwing quite royally, will get divided and fight for their own separate things and won't see what unites them and the way in which they're all struggling against the same system. So I completely understand the centrality of racial issues in America, of gendered issues in America. But the lesson that I try to argue in this book is not to forget about race and gender. or other identity issues, but to show that historically and today, the best way to make progress around these things is by being a kind of systemic populist, by uniting all these different groups that are suffering and struggling, racial groups that are being pitted against each other. I mean, that's what capitalism is all about. It's about pitting together, pitting against each other, the people who, if they united, would be would overthrow the rule of these robber barons who have long run the country. Now, another way of trying to, so yes, so I don't know. I'm glad you really referred. I want to make sure I've addressed your question, because it's really important that I'm not trying to argue that civil rights or anything like or gender politics is wrong. I'm trying to say, if you really believe in those rights, what history suggests is that you've got to have a populist style of party rather than a siloed kind of identity politics, which sort of makes invisible the common threads that white workers and black workers and female workers have in common. And those are very fundamental. It's not that racial issues are not fundamental, but to make progress in terms of these are all related to the larger economic and political system. And for the Democrats to become part of a kind of politics, it's moving away from populism toward this idea. It's ironic because like populism, this kind of liberal identity politics wants to help ordinary people. I'm not saying these are bad people who are doing this, but I think they have not understood what Martin Luther King finally understood. And Martin Luther King was no radical. This is sort of like a common sense understanding that if you're going to defeat, if you're whatever race you are, whatever gender you are, if you're going to, it's not like there aren't specific issues that you want to deal with as a black person or woman or whatever. But if you want a movement that's going to take the country in a new direction, to run only in terms of a race or whatever, when the issues that you're facing are shared by millions of other people who are not your race or who are not your gender, what I've tried to show in this book is that you have a real chance of making a difference when you find a way of uniting across these lines, which are lines that capitalist elites love to see. When they see blacks and whites divided, or blacks and browns divided, or citizens against immigrants, this is their cup of tea. This is what they dream for. And Trump has run a politics clearly he runs a right-wing identity politics saying, look, I'm going to stand up for all you white working people, And the answer for that is partly, of course, to defend the rights of non-white people. But the only way you can successfully do that and beat Trump is by building, this is what positive populism always shows. You win politically when you unite in a very large cross-race, cross-gender coalition, mostly around the shared economic problems that everybody who's hurting in America is feeling right now. This is real democracy. If you want to know, democracy is in the air. People say they're fighting for democracy on the streets. Real democracy is, having control over your work life and your economy as well as over your politics. Because who runs American politics? I mean, think of the amount of money that the real deep state in America are the descendants of, Morgan and Rockefeller and, these people who we saw surround.
Or what you call in the title, the oligarchy.
The oligarchy, correct. The oligarchy runs America. They run it with money, and the only way they can keep running it is by dividing Americans by race and by gender and by immigration status. That is what right-wing populism is all about. And
I think, real quick, I think the biggest issue is that liberal identity politics, it will deal with every issue except class.
Right.
I wouldn't say that I'm a class reductionist, but if class isn't part of it, then you're in a dead end. If that does that make sense?
Well, I would go even further. I would say go back to the New Deal again, the most important reform period. If you think about the J.P. Morgan and John Rockefeller, the oligarchs who have run America for 150 years, when did they have some curb on their power? It happened during the New Deal. And when it happened, when there was a president who said, I'm a traitor, they called him a traitor to his class. He was wealthy, but he said, I'm going to always stand up for the working people. He said, you should push me as far as possible. And he really fought around class economic issues. So you don't have to be a Marxist to say that people's economic standing is central to the way they're able to, the way they think about their society, the way they think about politics, and the way they can make change. I mean, I think what I try to show in this book is that whenever we've had major progressive reform in the society, or even bigger change that's systemic, you've got to deal with economic class. America is a country that is so organized around money and around the power of people with enormous amounts of money. We are more unequal than any other major country. And we've given corporations, I've often written about the fact that we call corporations constitutionally protected citizens, which means their money is redefined by courts as speech. So if you try to curb the money, like the money that Elon Musk is going to pour into the midterms coming up, that's considered free speech. Whatever much money he pays. So if you try to say Elon Musk should not be allowed to put that much money into the midterms, he can go to court and say, and this is, by the way, part of American law, because the corporations have shaped the Supreme Court and the way those courts operate. In fact, they had a role, I mean, way back, even at the beginning of the country, who founded America? It's important to understand. I mean, who was George Washington? He was one of the richest men in the colonies. He had more slaves than any other American. All the people, John Hancock, from my town of Boston, a rich businessman at the time, the rich merchants, the people who wrote the Constitution had property in mind. They wanted to protect property, which is fine. But in doing so, they made money. This happened under the first Gilded Age. They made money a form of speech. And they said that business basically was all about protecting the rights of these very, very rich oligarchs to use their money to buy the political system. So if you want to, I know Trump talked about the deep state. There is a deep state, but it's not the civil servants who are basically, middle-class people who, working in government bureaucracies of one kind or another. It's these very, 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 these people who are, multi-billionaires and are putting more and more of their money into funding both parties. And Trump is ruling with an oligarchy of the richest people ever in history, most of them out in Silicon Valley, and they're scary for a lot of reasons we can talk about. And the Democrats have also been taking a lot of their money from very wealthy people, understandably, because they have so much money to give. So my argument is, if you're not talking about class, you're not talking about real power. And if you want to talk about real power, if you want real change, if you believe the country is really, really in trouble in terms of the way in which our whole system is organized, the way the economy, the way the corporate rich are able to run this country so powerfully, then you've got to bring class back into a kind of populist politics. Populism
Well,
is
yeah,
all about that.
especially because it's what you said earlier in the book, which is with the mainstream establishment Democrat politics, it's I mean, it may be a little bit better than what Republicans are offering, but really what it amounts to is different siloed groups scrambling for breadcrumbs from the corporate overlords.
Right. Right. If you're divided, if you're not unified by your kind of economic demands, what do you have going? All you can do is say, look at me. You're looking at the rich people and you're saying, give me some rights. And in doing so, you're competing. The elites are looking down and saying, oh, gee, there are all those little people down there. There's this group over here that wants this, and there's this that's going to each cost a little bit of money or political capital. And so you're competing. And it really does produce competition among blacks against browns, against women, against men, and so forth. That is a losing strategy if you're black or if you're female. The only winning strategy, I argue from history, as well as from just sort of basic common sense, is if you've got a country being run by an oligarchy just means a small group of people with a lot of resources, mainly money. The only way you can really, really challenge their power and make a difference is by uniting. What we've got is numbers. What we've got is people in the millions. They've got a few, 10 people, one person, Musk, has more wealth than the majority, 50% of Americans. These tiny number of people, the 10 richest Americans, you have a podcast, they don't own you. But the nine richest of the 10 richest Americans, 9 of them have major media empires today. So the news and media and social media are increasingly run. And I'm talking about a really tiny group of people. You can talk about really not just the 1%, but the 1% of the 1%. They have about 25% of the wealth of the country, just a few thousand, billionaires. So, the country is being dominated by an oligarchic, tiny, wealthy group that never in history has there been such a small group of people with such a large amount of money. And they have the power to buy the government. And therefore, the Democrats can only really make a difference if they basically challenge that system. Because if they just buy in with continue to say, well, we're going to stand up for Black women, but we're going to get corporate money to do it, they're going to get swallowed up in the corporate machine. And what comes out is going to be, at best, petty reforms, which are not going to really make a difference. And I can say that because I've looked at how this has worked historically. And I know from the history that when you move away from these unifying populist class issues, you get small reforms. I mean, Bill Clinton and Obama got small reforms, but nothing that really, the country under both Clinton and Obama went further toward war after 9/11. The inequality, if you look at the rise of inequality, it got much, much worse in that period. Ordinary people, they ended up voting for Trump because after Clinton and Obama, most ordinary people were, and this was true even after Joe Biden, who had some more progressive. Biden is an interesting exception because Biden sort of began to talk a little bit about populist language, but he was absolutely relentless militarist who was spending tons of money on war. And I don't want to end the conversation without saying that war is an important part of this conversation because war is part of the oligarchy. The oligarchy depends on war. Lockheed Martin got the biggest military contractor in the country, got its highest stock price ever the first day of the Iran war. We are seeing, Trump ran on saying he was going to end these forever wars. He was going to bring back the money that was the trillions of dollars being spent on war to help ordinary working Americans. He betrayed them on that promise as well. He's been amping up the military, put over $1 trillion into the military, and he's bringing along the Silicon Valley people who are using AI and all kinds of data surveillance to wage war, including against when you're waging war, as you said, far-right populism is war against the enemy within. When you have the technology that you can, basically collect data on you and me, they're listening to this conversation, they're listening to my students on their feeds, they know when my students are having breakfast and what they're eating. I don't want to sound like a paranoid theorist, but my students tell me that they get feedback from they're on Instagram or TikTok 4 or 5 hours a day. They say that everything about them is known and they get feedback from it. So the enemy within is being fought, and the enemy abroad is being fought with money that's going to this oligarchy and is being diverted. The Iran war is a massive betrayal of the workers who voted for Trump. Why? What are they going to be paying at the pump? Right now, the Straits of Hormuz are closed. That closes off 20% of the world's oil supply. The fertilizer that goes into agriculture in America is being shut off by the Strait of Hormuz imports as well. Strait of Hormuz is a little small water, about a 20-mile waterway that's between Iran and Saudi Arabia and up in the north in Iraq. About 20% of the world's oil and trade goes through there. That's been shut off now. We're spending massive amounts of money on this war, and we're still going with Cuba and Venezuela and so forth. It's very, very good for these big companies, whether they're AI companies or they're Lockheed Martin or they're Raytheon or General Dynamics. But for ordinary Americans, it's really a betrayal because they voted for Trump saying he was going to take all this money going into the wars and bring it back into healthcare and into housing construction and into cheap goods at home. And it's what we're seeing now is a kind of emerging stagflation. Prices are going up because of his tariffs and because of the war. Wars really spike prices up because supply chains get shut, particularly now. A war in the Middle East cuts off supply. So, war is about the most anti-populist thing you can do. Populism really comes from the word the people, right? Populism is a politics of the people. Well, a war is politics of these very wealthy elites who have, that's what, there's a reason their stock prices are going up. They are waking out like bandits with this war. They're getting huge government contracts on surveillance for targeting. Much of the early Iran targets were done by AI.
Well, this is why again Martin Luther King was also very involved in the
Right,
anti-war movement because
right,
it was about anti-racism, class justice, or fighting poverty and fighting against the warmongers. So you
right.
need a three-pronged approach to deal with
Right.
all of
And
this.
while there's ideals and morals, all that, you don't have to be a leftist. It's one of the things I show in the book. I don't know if you saw this. I looked a lot at polling of not just ordinary working people, but the Trump base. So there's a lot in this book that shows what do Trump people actually want. And it turns out that they've been moving toward a positive populist attitude. They hate 70% of the Trump base say they hate big corporations and banks. About 70% also say they like labor, they're anti-war. In other words, the Trump base, and I have a lot in the book where, they also, by the way, they need connections with other people. We talked about this when we talked about the book Bonfire, that, this positive populism also has to deal with the kind of emotional disconnection that people in a tech society where they're not communicate, they're either too busy working to have a lot of friends or they're so busy online with looking up interesting videos, whatever. They're not connecting with other people. So positive populism it unites people of different groups, but it also brings people together in town halls, on the streets, in protests. And that's really, really central. So another element of that the Democratic Party has missed is politics is all about ordinary people believing in something and getting together. And these movements, populist part, they're movement politics, like Martin Luther King, getting people together in protest, singing. It could be from the church, it could be from communities, but that's central to what's going on.
I want to ask you a bit of a pointed or maybe devil's advocate question, but I have to lay it out first. And I want to use the example of Reagan for this. You know, uh, there was a lot of working class support for Reagan, but he comes in and he just drops a cinder block on the unions. First, by going after the air traffic controllers, famously firing, I believe, 11,000. And yet, people still voted for him a second time. Um, and I think you would frame it as just fundamentally irrational, but is it possible that it's rational within their own cultural priorities? What I mean is, I think there's people that do vote for Trump because they have a cruel attitudes towards immigrants, for instance, and they don't care about how he's economically undermining them. So how do we square that?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, on the one hand, the data today show that economic issues are far and away the biggest issues in America. So people really, because they have to, you can't live if you can't pay your rent or you can't pay your groceries. It doesn't matter what your ideas are, you're not going to make it through the day. You can't support your children. So those are very fundamental. And so I think that I just think that populism identifies what everybody really, really has on the table that they can't abandon. Now, Reagan, you said people may really feel that their economics are not important. They don't like immigrants in the country. Well, there's two things I would say quickly about that. One is if you look at the polling today, about 60% of Americans, including the swing vote of independents, so independents are the biggest voting bloc in the country, there are going up against Trump's immigration policy. People want secure borders, but they don't like this kind of violence where he's he's saying immigrants are violent criminals. The data show that about 97% of the ICE detainees have never had a criminal record, have never committed any crime at all. So people want secure borders. But they don't want this kind of gratuitous violence, And I mean, in that sense, I have more faith in Americans. But even if you just think people are motivated by the most basic self-interested things, the self-interest of ordinary Americans today is banding together that you can pay your rent this month and that you can pay. I mean, I live in a place where, students have to pay $3,000 a month to get a place to live. It's just impossible. They're paying $100,000 to go to school. The prices are off scale. People really can't afford it. And the masses of Americans, again, I want to say 61% of Americans say over and over again, they're living paycheck to paycheck. That's a class signal. It's saying, like, I'm afraid I'm going to fall into poverty with one illness, one loss of a job. If you do lose your job, you're in trouble because the job market is called a frozen job market. You may have a job. To try to find a new one is very hard. With the war, it's going to become even more difficult. So I think let's assume that people don't like immigrants and are very self-interested. They would still end up voting for what I'm calling positive populism because it would support their fundamental right to have a basic way living, to have health care, to have a job, to have a wage that can pay the rent. And it suggests we should have secure borders to protect the country, but we don't want any of this gratuitous violence, which is basically, I mean, the war on immigrants is wiping out much of the construction business, the agricultural business. You're taking away work that Americans don't want to do. So, the companies that want to do a lot of the farm work or whatever, they can't find workers to do it, which adds to the supply side, which pushes up prices as well. So I think this positive populist approach is very down to earth. It recognizes people might not be afraid of immigrants who are taking their job, but it offers a way of thinking about that shows how you can really make a difference and how you can pay your rent. And I agree with you. This is not to reduce everything to class or to economics. Life is about more than money, for sure. But to make the basic change, you've got to, when the majority of people are hurting economically or feeling they might not make it, you've got to start with the foundation because that's survival. That's basic survival. People are functioning at the level of survival instincts. And, populism says, there's more to life than survival. But you've got to start by assuring that people's basic right to survival is intact. And that's what a positive populist movement will do. Now, it has a lot of moral, like if you take Martin Luther King, it has a lot of spiritual. We haven't talked about religion. And it's worth saying that far-right populism, the Trump version, that also has a history of being very tied to Christian nationalism. And, so in the name, Reagan, the far right, ever since the, Goldwater and, Nixon, they claim to be religious, as Trump is, and they claim to represent religious values. But in fact, by representing these rich elites who are screwing ordinary people and going after the stranger, who, as many pastors point out, Jesus would have said, welcome the stranger. As long as the stranger is not violating laws or being. So I think that, it's really important to recognize that I'm not trying to say only think about economics, but what the Democratic Party has done has been abandoned the fundamentals that can make people trust that they can survive and pay the rent next month, and they have
I
reason.
guess though, not to interrupt you, but I guess I'm asking, why are there people that get seduced by the sort of right-wing populists over and over again? Because like I said, Reagan dropped a cinder block on the unions. Jesse Jackson tried to mount the Rainbow Coalition. It didn't work. But why does this keep happening, I guess?
Yeah, this is a great question. Well, I think there are a lot of different parts of that. One is that identity is important, people's personal identity. So and your religion is important. So if you have a leader like Trump, who's obviously not a religious person, never really claimed, but who is saying, I'm going to bring back, Christmas and Christianity, it's very, very seductive to people, number one. Two, there's a lot of lying going on. Remember, I was saying the one of the ways that the media, the oligarchs rule is by control of the media. And so Trump is a notorious liar. And so they're telling all kinds of untruths about immigrants, about law and order, about who is the enemy of the country. And yeah, they have so much money that they control the algorithms in the social media and they control the news it pumps out. That's why podcasts are important. They're a source of some independent, analysis and commentary. And so, and then there's a long tradition since the Cold War of saying that Americans are, at risk of being attacked by communists or Marxists or terrorists. And that always is a kind of fear mongering. Fear is very powerful. Why do
And they
people
have a
respond?
very big, as you put it, they can push this fear through a vast noise machine. I'm
Yeah,
not big on quoting Clinton, but
right,
in a lot of ways, there was sort of a vast right-wing
right,
conspiracy. There was
absolutely.
a right-wing media ecosystem.
You go back to Orwell's 1984, that they were the three-minute hate sessions where everybody gets together to chat and against the enemy who was just sort of blurry out there, but was from the Middle East, was Muslim, whatever. I mean, hate is a very powerful fear. And, the far right populists are really good at getting people to hate other people and to divide them. And the Democrats played into that by focusing on siloed race and gender politics. And so, if you ask me, why is it so powerful? It's because they're playing with people's emotions around issues that are very central to their identity, and they lie about it, and they have the resources to make the lie look like truth. I mean, I go back and say, why did people support Big Brother in 1984? It's when you have the ability to control what people are thinking about, and with the Silicon Valley, social media is really scary about this. You have a lot of power. And they've lied. I mean, when you ask Trump, how is he doing with that promise to workers about jobs and bringing back manufacturing jobs? He says, we couldn't be better. Gas prices are great. He said, I went to California, gas prices were $1.99 a gallon. Well, go today, it's like he's doing a war that's going to spike those prices unbelievably high. So, and they play to powerful emotions, fear, anxiety about economic anxiety. And if you don't have an alternative movement that's telling truth in a persuasive way, doesn't have access to media, doesn't have access to major political parties that will really tell the truth, you fall back on your fear. You're going to fall back and live in fear and respond to this right-wing populist stuff as long as you don't see an option. A lot of people voting for Reagan again, they saw that the Democrats had sort of lost their way. They had lost the New Deal. They weren't this third way of Clinton was so vague that it didn't really seem to represent anything. Maybe he was going to help a little bit of civil rights for Black people and women for Hillary, but it just wasn't going to cut it for ordinary people. So, and as you've said right from the beginning of this conversation, and I really appreciate you doing it, the right-wing populism has a long history, this fear-mongering, this hate, cultivating hate of other parts of the population, this scrambling for breadcrumbs from the elites that they're willing to, scatter around to ordinary people. This has a long history in America. So, America runs on this kind of gasoline. It's like climate change oil. It's really embedded in American political psychology. At the same time, I want to emphasize, and I do show it in the book, that while I talk a lot about this history of far right, and I'm really glad you started with it because it's really important. I don't think people know the history of far right populism. They think of Trump as sort of novel, doing something completely new. It's really deeply embedded in American society. But there's also this much more positive story about positive populism. And the book tells it in a way that I think gives people some sense, one, how to deal with fear, two, how to deal with the real problems they're facing, and three, the kind of politics we need from the Democratic Party if you're going to really lean on the Democratic Party as the way to get away from Trump and the oligarchy.
If you have time, there a few extra minutes. I just had
Sure,
two
sure,
things.
sure.
Okay. So I know one of the aspects of the book that people are going to want me to talk about because it's a hot button issue is you critique cancel culture a bit. And I'm weirdly of two minds on this idea of cancel culture because I sort of get what people mean when they're criticizing it, but at the same time I also see people that seem to think that oh, you can't have any criticism. You can't, like, for instance, I see people that will refer to boycotting as a form of cancel culture. And I think people have a right to boycott.
Right.
But I get the critique, but I also think that there's times where the term is used too broadly.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, I do. The book has a lot of critique of cancel culture. I mean, it says cancel culture is important. I think, after the New Deal, particularly, this siloed identity politics led to many groups in the population, particularly white males, feeling like, oh God, what if I use the wrong pronoun in addressing this person? Or what if I mean, there is a lot about cancel culture that is red meat for far right populism. And it's unfair to ordinary people. It puts people in the position of saying, gee, am I going to use a word that other people are, it sort of cultivates a kind of fear itself of anything I say is going to be turned against me in some way, right? And so that is something that populists have to always be concerned with. And left movements have long had cancel cultures. They've been often had dogma. I lived through a lot of that. It's not nice. It's not fun to live with. So I don't like cancel culture. On the other hand, I agree with you that there are certain things you shouldn't yell fire in a crowded theater, and there are things that you shouldn't say to other people that are hurtful or untrue, that just common decency and caring would suggest that you don't do it. But I do argue in the book that if you're going to win over a lot of these Trump people who really agree with you about a lot of the economic and military issues that we're dealing with, you don't want to drive them away because they're afraid of using the wrong pronoun.
Do you agree too that something like boycotting is sort of a political tool that can be used
Oh,
positively?
absolutely. Boycotting has been an absolutely valuable tool all through. I mean, the civil rights movement, used boycotts against segregated stores, which were very effective in desegregating stores, like in Birmingham, the Birmingham movement. The farm workers boycott. I think boycotts, the boycotting now of companies that are trying to put their warehouses into ICE ownership. That's a kind of boycott where the protest is becoming politically effective, right? The boycott, if you're going to deal with the oligarchy, the thing that the oligarchy listens to is money. If they know when they're helping jail, all these innocent people like who have not committed crime, and it's pretty scary. What do you want those people to feel the pinch of the boycott? A boycott has always, I mean, labor and class struggles have always been about boycotts. You're boycotting companies. One of the few tools that consumers and workers have to force oligarchs, these very wealthy people, to listen to you. So, to my mind, boycotting is an incredibly important, you know, political and class weapon.
This brings us to one of the key quotes that I pulled from the book, which is a positive populism is infused by empathy for and dialogue with those with different cultural and religious values. It can bridge those differences only with a radical culture of compassion and community while offering transformative class-based economic changes, uniting working people across current cultural divides. Can you just speak to that a little bit more briefly before we close
Yeah, and
out?
thank you. You identify so brilliantly so much of the key argument in the book. So, reaching out in a positive, popular way to working class people means you're going to be reaching out to people who often don't share. If you're like a upper middle class, college educated person. I don't know what your audience is like, but I suspect many people have gone to college. You've gone to, you know, you are going to have to be in communication with and in solidarity with all these masses of people who are being hurt by the same enemies that you're facing, which are these rich people who are controlling everything in the country. So I feel like, I mean, this has always been a problem. If I go back to the Gilded Age populists, they were farmers and they had to relate to white farmers who were populists had to relate to blacks and racist whites who were feeling the same thing. In the New Deal, there was a question of could the New Deal Democrat of Franklin Roosevelt, could it bring whites and blacks together? It was hard because the cultural divisions were very strong. Roosevelt was careful about that. But my broader thought, and again, I thank you for bringing this up because it's so central. If you're going to be populist, as we said, you have to build a very broad coalition. It can't just be about people like me. If you're a positive populist, it means you're finding common ground with people who are struggling against the same power elites, these tiny elites that you are. And those are often going to be people with a different religion or a different cultural point of view. So there's a kind, how do you deal with that? I mean, it's very hard to communicate across deep cultural lines, but if you really, that's the virtue of a populist politics. If you're looking very hard at the way the society is working, whether you're a religious, a Christian or a secular person or a Muslim, whatever you are, if you're an American, you're dealing with the oligarchy. You share that. So you've got to say, look, I can accept somebody. This country was built around the idea that we don't have a single state religion. I can deal with people with have different values in various ways, but we share something very important. And, there is underneath your question is the idea of how do you reach out to people who are culturally different than yourself? And it isn't easy. It can be because traditionally there's long histories of enemy and adversity and so forth. I got to tell you, I've been very encouraged by, I never believed that this many white traditional, I'm looking at the people in the resistance out in the anti-Trump resistance in places like Utah or, Tennessee or Texas. There are a lot of conservative states where millions of white ordinary people who are conservative are coming out on the street against ICE and the brutality against these immigrants. I never expected that. If you look at, you go to images that you can see on TV or online of who these people are out in the streets, they're not the radical students that were in the Vietnam era. They're middle-aged, white, low working class people who know somebody in their, in their bar, the bar or the dining, the restaurant down the street where a waiter who was an immigrant got picked up, and they know that waiter and they know the family a little bit. I'm really, really struck and really moved by the empathy that these people who are struggling themselves have had for people who are being subjected to such terrible violence and who are afraid to send their kids to school. They're afraid to go out to get groceries because they think they're going to get picked up and deported. So I think the resistance is already documenting and demonstrating that this kind of empathy is not just some academic theoretical thing. It's being shown out on the streets every day. You've got millions of ordinary working people who are showing a kind of caring and sort of disgust with the very violent treatment by ICE of these people who are not criminals and who are in the country legally. It's just very moving to me. And it is, I'm glad you asked this question. I'm glad of so many of the questions you've asked today because they're so important. It is foundational to a good kind of populism because that rests on being able to feel something for other people. The problem with America is that it focuses so much on self-interest and the idea that everybody working hard, just focusing on themselves will make for a good society. And it means I don't have to care about you. I may think you're an interesting, but I don't really give a damn about you or your health or your family or whatever. And, the populist thing does require, because the stakes are so high, that you're able to reach across comfort and reach across common cultural foundations to feel for people and unite with people, whether it's in a boycott or for just preventing violence, whatever it is, out of basic shared human values. And I think it's just very central to populism. And I'm saying, I think it's not an academic idea. It's being shown on the streets every day.
Well, I was going to say we've seen resistance to Trump in some of the strangest quarters. Now,
Yeah,
I'm not
right,
a fan of them, but even Ammon Bundy of the Bundy rancher family,
right,
those
right,
anti-government types, I mean, he came out and wrote an entire essay called The Stranger a few months ago, where he said this is a whole moral failure what they're doing to undocumented immigrants. And he said
right,
it's this is disgusting. This is police state stuff. And I'm
yeah.
like, oh, I guess I agree with Ammon Bundy on this. It's
Yeah,
strange.
and people like Joe Rogan,
Yeah.
these right-wing podcasters, a lot of them are saying just what you're saying, and so I think you can reach across those. And it takes emotional work and caring. But again, I got to tell you, I never expected this many people who are sort of more traditional, more conservative, to get out there on the streets and say, I'm not going to stand for this kind of police state tactics in America. They just don't. And that's just very reassuring. And it's sort of an affirmation of a lot of the values that I'm talking about in the book, to say this is possible. They're showing it.
Very last thing I want to ask you. You mentioned how high the stakes are.
Mm.
We didn't talk as much about the term oligarchy, but it did hang over our conversation. And I'm curious, I get the feeling reading your book that you do not view oligarchy as simply a political threat, but also potentially a civilizational or just simply existential threat for humanity itself. Can you speak to that? Am I on
Yeah.
the right
Oh,
track?
yes, you are. I mean, I wrote a book called Dying for Capitalism a few years ago, and capitalism is becoming an existential threat, partly because of the environmental issues that climate change is obviously threatens the planet in many ways. The war we're in, when you think about nuclear war, most analysts believe that nuclear war will arise from an escalation of a conventional war. So could the Iran war escalate? Well, Russia is providing, intelligence to Iran about American targets. The Chinese are heavily dependent on the oil that's coming out of the blocked Straits of Hormuz. Um, there's a lot of risk, even just in this Middle Eastern regional war, and remember, militarism, anti-war, like Martin Luther King said, as I argue in this book, is very central to positive populism. War is the action of violent action of the elites against anybody standing their way around the world. And that's the way Trump is treating Iran right now. So we're at a very dangerous point. But you cut on, as you typically do, to something broader even than just the war going on or climate change, which is that the oligarchy itself is reconstituting itself continuously. Now, it's not the oligarchy of JP Morgan and Rockefeller, although that oligarchy is still important. There's big oil, there's big finance, it's very important. But we're moving toward a new reconstituted oligarchy, which includes those groups, but includes, I think at the heart of that new group are the Silicon Valley oligarchs, who are the richest and the most militarized members of. So when you look at what's happening in the war today, the targeting of targets in Iran are being chosen by AI. It's these, remember that Anthropic, this high-tech company, is suing the Pentagon because it said if you use Claude, which is their product, their high-tech product, they said this is going to unleash an automated war, basically autonomous weapons that will be able to simply choose to launch and target based on their own without human intervention. And they said that is unethical. This is the company that would make a lot of money off Claude being their product, an AI product. They're saying it's unethical, and they've gone to court to try to stop the Pentagon from using it. So we're in the middle of a trend. Now, that's a good side that you don't see very often among these companies. They're saying we're willing to sacrifice profit to prevent war from becoming completely automated. But the broader focus here is that, those seven magnificent companies, as they're called, the Magnificent Seven, they constitute about 40% of the market capitalization of the country. They're probably the most powerful companies that have ever been created, and they are increasingly integrated with the military. They constitute an existential threat to you and me because they're listening to us, and they're putting that data into surveillance operations, which would make 1984 pale in comparison. And they're using it to target military targets around the world, as well as trade targets and so forth. So there's something about this new class of robber barons and the politics that it's moved toward as it's aligned with Trump, which is existential in its character because it's not just making money. It's concentrating more money in smaller hands that is so unequal that it's going to create. Remember, jobs are at risk. Many people believe, we don't know, but many people a lot of jobs have already been lost to AI. AI may take away many, many more jobs, millions and millions of jobs. So we're moving in, that could be existential for large numbers of people in the workforce as jobs are eliminated. And then you've got these data centers, which are sucking up enormous amounts of energy and leaving whole communities without sources of water, without sources of electricity, and so forth. So there's something in the new, as I look at this new robber baron elite, it's sort of engaged in making money off of things that will lead toward destruction of the environment, destruction of other countries, and destruction of large numbers of people in this country. So this is not just ordinary capitalism. It's capitalism which has the technology and the concentration of capital and the hardline far right war against the enemy within, as you say, the enemy, the mobilization of people to fight and destroy a demonic enemy, which is typically either an immigrant or a black or a brown person. That is existential. So, we've moved from ordinary politics into the realm of existential politics. Now, again, from a populist point of view, just to tie it into our conversation, populism is about existential issues. Populism arises when people feel their existence is at stake in some way. And more Americans believe either their economic existence or their life is at risk. And so you're absolutely right. And I appreciate it again, because you're such a good reader of this material and think about it so creatively, that what I'm really arguing in this book is that our collective existence is being threatened. This is not ordinary. This is not just a sort of challenge to ordinary elites. These are elites whose money and power rests on extracting from the earth and from other nations and from Americans themselves kinds of resources that are deadly and that threaten our lives. So in some way, I'm arguing that we need this kind of collective empathy and feeling for each other and response just as a survival mechanism, because we're dealing with a regime that is not interested in our survival. It's not surprising that the biggest oligarchs like Bezos and Musk are space companies now. SpaceX and Blue Origin, the two, those are Musk's and Bezos' space company. Musk has said, we're not going to be able to live on Earth very long. I want to be the person colonizing outer space. He's going to control the satellites and control wherever we end up going. So there's a kind of class consciousness among the very, very elites, which are saying, we sort of know what we're doing. We're making a lot of money, but we've got to have planet B where we can go, and we're going to have the space infrastructure to make that happen. So I think we really are dealing with an existential meaning. Our existence is threatened. And this is not ordinary politics. Populist politics is saying this is about our existence, our collective existence. This is where your culture, to be able to when do you reach across these cultural lines? When your existence is threatened, you've got to find the largest set of community you can to work against this very small group that is bringing us toward threatening our entire existence. And there's reason to be hopeful. I just want to say that sounds so good. I want to say what I've tried to do in the book is show there's a history that ought not just to be Pollyannish, but there's a reason to believe that this kind of unifying across different categories and coming together with the kind of feeling that you were describing, empathy you're trying, can save our lives.
Well, I think that's a more positive note to end on. I want to thank you again, Charles Derber, for coming on Parallax Views, and I hope everyone checks out the book. How can my listeners get a hold of it?
So I hate to say Amazon, but it's the easiest way most people can find books. And if you Google it, you'll find other sources of the book and so forth. But I hope people will take a look, because I wrote it for a general audience. It's not for the academic community. So,
well, check it out. Fighting Oligarchy. Thank you again, Charles Derber.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Aaron, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Nobody, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.